Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm here today to talk about our intention to take action to end the labour dispute between Canada Post and the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, also known as CUPW. Depuis le début des négociations.
Since bargaining began between Canada Post and the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, we have done our best to help the parties find a solution.
Collective bargaining process, Mr. Speaker. Negotiated agreements are always the best solution. We wouldn't come down this road. However, we have exhausted every option. Our government ran on a commitment to restore fair and balanced labour laws and relations, but we also have a responsibility to Canadian businesses that drive our economy. As our country's primary postal operator, Canadians and Canadian businesses rely on Canada Post. Canada Post and the Canadian Union of Postal Workers provide postal services which again are of vital importance to Canadians and to Canadian businesses. Older Canadians, persons with disabilities, low-income earners, as well as Canadians living in rural, remote and northern areas who rely on physical mail delivery, including Indigenous peoples, are disproportionately affected during postal strikes. The cost of postal alternatives, such as courier companies, can be prohibitively high, especially in rural and remote areas. And in some remote northern areas, there are no alternatives. Canadians living in the north are more reliant on parcel delivery services than other Canadians, receiving approximately double the per capita parcel average in Canada in 2017. And while e-commerce and e-communications are the norm for many, almost 9 million Canadians, about 30% of the population, live in rural and remote areas where access to the internet can be extremely limited. And we know that some of the most vulnerable in our country count on Canada Post for their checks. These Canadians count on this money to scrape by, and they're put in very precarious positions by any delay. Like Jack, who told me, as a person on Ontario disability, that any delay could mean a loss of housing for him, and the many others who rely on prompt payment to survive month to month. The strikes have been going on for 5 weeks now. Canada Post said that they could expect delays of parcel and mail delivery in 2019 as a result of these rotating strikes. Canada Post has also told its commercial customers that at this point it cannot honour its delivery standards for any product because of the prolonged strikes. And the strikes have created backlogs of mails and parcels just days before an expected rush of millions of additional parcels from Black Friday and Cyber Monday online sales. Businesses are already feeling the negative impacts of the strikes. Significant delivery delays are resulting in order for many Canadian businesses that are dependent on sales from Black Friday through to the end of the holiday to survive. And there are reports of decline in e-commerce demand. The impacts of the rotating strikes are particularly pronounced for small and medium-sized businesses because the fourth quarter is their busiest. Mr. Speaker, the reality is if the strikes are left to continue through the holiday season, they would create significant hardship. And that means job losses and fewer hours for Canadians who are counting on that extra money to get by. And at the same time, Canada Post has asked its international partners to halt mail and parcel shipments to Canada as it continues to deal with a major delivery backlog that has grown as a result of the rotating strikes. And this affects not only Canadians and Canadian businesses, but also Canada's reputation as a reliable market for commerce and trade. Mr. Speaker, small and medium-sized businesses that rely more heavily on Canada Post for billing and order fulfillment are struggling. And some of these smaller companies operating on eBay and Etsy and Amazon platforms as e-sellers are disproportionately affected. According to a survey conducted on behalf of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, or the CFIB, 2/3 of small and medium-sized enterprises surveyed said they are being affected by the rotating strikes at Canada Post. And according to the CFIB, costs are around $3,000 per business in terms of lost sales, cancelled orders, delays, or costs due to the use of more expensive delivery alternatives. E-commerce is a significant source of economic growth in Canada. Compared to the 2011 postal strike, Canadians in 2018 have become greater consumers of e-commerce-generated parcels. According to Statistics Canada, internet-based sales from all retailers rose 31% to $15.7 billion in 2017, and up to 40% of these sales take place in the fourth quarter, which is currently being affected by the strike. In the event of an even longer postal strike, many companies, particularly small e-commerce companies, are saying that they might not make it through the season. So let me tell you some of the real-life stories. There's a company called Monkeys and More based in Halifax. It's run by Dale Kearney and his wife Sherry, and they specialize in selling handmade scarves, mittens, and aprons online. And they get orders from Canada and the U.S. during the holidays. But this year, customers are reluctant to place orders for fear that they won't receive their purchase by Christmas. And Mr. Kearney said, in normal years, we're sold out by now, but the rotating strike is killing us. And how about Red Ribbon Boutique? This is a shop on Edmonton's High Street. It's run by owner Rochelle Tuck. And Rochelle relies heavily on Canada Post as most of its sales are done online. And Mrs. Tuck said she knows that packages will be late arriving to customers, but exactly how late is a mystery to her. Mr. Speaker, small businesses like theirs are slowly becoming casualties of the ongoing Canada Post dispute. Comments from Craig Patterson, Director of Applied Research at the University of Alberta School of Retailing, says their small business margins are a lot thinner than the major retailers. They're relying on Canada Post a lot more, whereas bigger retailers can go to an alternative supplier. And many customers, instead of taking the chance, will choose to go to malls as opposed to seeking out local businesses, meaning money will often leave the local economies. And the strike is having an impact on the workers as well. Canada Post workers and other businesses affected are counting on the extra wages from this time of year as part of their revenue. In some cases, they need these wages to get by. Canadians are calling on us to take action. The Retail Council of Canada sent an open letter to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and said that the group said that the situation is heading into crisis territory. The pace of parcel traffic is about to double, and the postal system is already overstretched. Now, Mr. Speaker, we are not debating this legislation today because we still believe that Canada Post and Cup W can get a deal. I repeat, I believe the two parties can still reach a negotiated agreement. Nous croyons toujours.
We still believe that an agreement is possible, but we must be prepared to take action if the parties do not succeed.
Negotiating, and nothing in this motion prevents that from continuing. We continue to provide them with all of the tools necessary to reach an agreement. Their negotiations started this time last year. The existing collective bargaining agreement expired on January 31st, 2018, and these agreements covered approximately 8,000 rural and suburban letter carriers and 42,000 urban operations employees. On June 29, 2018, the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service received 2 notices of dispute from the union. The following week, on July 6, 2018, 2 conciliation officers were appointed to assist in the negotiations. On September 5, 2018, I appointed 2 mediators. Cup W began strike action on October 22nd. On October 24, 2018, I appointed the special mediator, Morton Michnick, and have reappointed him twice since then to facilitate an agreement. Voluntary arbitration was offered and declined. My colleague, the Honourable Carla Cultro, Minister of Public Services and Procurement Canada, and I have reached out to the parties directly on many occasions to urge them to continue to work towards reaching agreements. We've worked hard to restore fairness and balance to the labour landscape in Canada, and these efforts demonstrate that. Through Bill C-4, for example, our government's first piece of legislation—
Order. 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 The honourable member for North Island Powell River rising on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate you recognizing me. Just wanted to point out that in this place, as you've so lengthily reminded us, that it's not appropriate to name the member by name, but by riding or by roll. So thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank the honourable member for pointing that out. I did, in fact, see that the honourable member did make that error in the course of her remarks. Quite often when that occurs, if there's no disorder at the initial moment, we'll let that see. If it happens the second time, I'll often interrupt the member when that occurs. But I think the honourable minister will keep that in mind for the remainder of her remarks. The honourable Minister of Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I apologize for that error. Mr. Speaker, as I said, we've worked really hard to restore fairness and balance to the labour landscape in Canada. One of the first pieces of legislation that we introduced was Bill C-4, and this was repealing 2 private members' bills that were intentionally meant to undermine the rights of unions in this country. One that imposed excessive reporting requirements on unions, and a second that made it harder for workers to unionize. This was important to us because we understand that organized labour, in fact, supports these good middle-class jobs that we talk about so often in this place. In fact, we've taken other action, prompted by the union movement. We've introduced modern labour standards just as recently as last month that are going to directly work in opposition to other Conservative governments that are repealing the rights of workers. We introduced pay equity to ensure that women have an opportunity to receive equal pay for work of equal value. Mr. Speaker, we were successful in passing and receiving Royal Incentive C-65, another piece of legislation that we worked on closely with organized labour to ensure that people are free from harassment and sexual violence in the workplace. And we will continue to work with organized labour to ensure that workers across this country can work in companies and for organizations where they are respected and where they have decent work. And as I mentioned before, we did not intervene early because we believe in the collective bargaining process. We have worked with the parties during this labour disruption to assist them in getting a deal with every tool that we have. But we also have a responsibility to all Canadians and to the businesses that drive our economy. And when the consequences of a work stoppage become so great that they begin to result in serious or lasting harm, we must act, Mr. Speaker. When a strike or a lockout is affecting thousands or even millions of people, the government must intervene. Mr. Speaker, the Canada Labour Code gives the parties in a dispute the right to a strike or lockout. And back-to-work legislation should be used as a last resort. We will continue to support the parties through every means possible. And as I said, we still believe that a deal is possible. Canadians can be assured to know that our government has done everything in our power to help the 2 parties to reach an agreement. Mr. Speaker, we believe in the collective bargaining process. We believe in fair and balanced labour relations. We will continue our work, yes, with organized labour to support decent work and middle-class jobs in this country. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.